People who lived in 70s/80s/90s, what was it really like? Story 1. It was quiet. I don't want to sound like a boomer, but it was really quiet. People spent more time just being outdoors and reading and sitting around not doing much. You couldn't just dial up whatever you wanted on a streaming service. If you wanted to learning something you had to go a library. There were even people at the library who were sort of human Google. You'd ask them a question and they'd go and find the answer. Correspondence was slower. You mailed things physically. You had to keep track of things like bank accounts and bills manually with pencil and paper because you couldn't just look up your balance. Parents weren't around as much. Kids came home from school and made themselves a snack, then got on their bikes and left. It's more be home by dinner and just, like, trust your kids would come back home. The world was smaller too. You knew about your town, your friends, maybe your family if they were close, and that was about it. You certainly didn't know what a celebrity was eating or what a guy in China was walking around doing all day. Story 2. I grew up in horse country in New Jersey in the 70s. We had 13 acres of fields and barns, a big farmhouse, tractors, go-karts, minibikes and snowmobiles. My sister had a pickup truck at age 15 that always had a bale of hay in the back because then it qualified as a farm truck and she was allowed to drive it. 2 of my neighbors/friends were on cow farms. One was raising beef, one was a milk farm. We rarely contacted in any way other than visiting. If you wanted to see what your friend was doing, you hopped on your minibike/ATV or whatever and rode over there. CB radios were the only real long-range communication stuff other than phone. When I was old enough I bolted an antenna to the top of the house and have great memories of talking with my friend 2 miles away while we were watching the same TV show. That was exciting. The 80s were wild and exciting. Technology was kicking it. Still pre-internet, but BBSs were the way to live and die. Logging in to see what people have said online in the last days was nifty. I ran a BBS on an Apple II clone that had a group of 25 or so localish people. Long distance charges were a thing, and every once in a while we'd have a party and everyone would meet in person. That was crazy. I went to a lot of rock concerts. A short list. Yes, I really saw all of these acts live. Pink Floyd Yard. Frankie Goes to Hollywood. Jethro Tull. Moody Blues. Boston. Bon Jovi. Grateful Dead. My First. Genesis. Billy Joel. Talking Heads. Printed catalogs were absolute king. Computer Shopper was a catalog that was hundreds of pages thick and was the equivalent of browsing eBay in print form. You could find just about anything in there. Compared to today, the biggest change is not having all the world's knowledge at your fingertips. You could argue for hours about whether the little kid says look mummy, there's no plane up in the sky, and have a dozen opinions, and there was no way to tell unless someone had the album/tape/whatever, and then you'd still argue. Rand McNally road atlases were fun as hell. I have in my hand a map of all the roads in the US. We can go anywhere. Story 3. Memories of the 1970s. Movies were very different, trying to be more realistic. Even the comedies had more bite to them. There was an energy crisis and everyone was obsessed with saving energy, using less electricity and gas. Cities were very dirty and neglected due to white flight. I grew up in a city, but people were often astonished that when I said I grew up in X city I didn't actually mean a suburb outside of the city. Disco was everywhere, and disco, now what we call clubbing, culture was pervasive. Politics were much more centrist. For instance, lefties hated Nixon, but there was no doubt he would support the era. Memories of the 1980s, neon, so much neon. Pastels everywhere, and somehow came to feel very assertive. Pink and turquoise ruled the day. Other aggressive fashion trends, asymmetrical everything, side ponytails, one long earring, wearing different colored shoes, etc. Baggy and oversized clothing, belts over shirts, feathered hair, huge shoulder pads. The Cold War cast a pall over everything. There was a feeling entire planet's population could be eliminated at any minute. And for those who survived, the result of the nuclear holocaust would make you wish you died. This saturated everything. Movies became sillier, more cartoon-y, and the era of runaway sequels was born. TV was dominated by family sitcoms with well-meaning, but slightly doofy parents and kids that were either smart as whips or dumb as rocks. Pop music was super fun, less serious and less sophisticated than in the 1970s. New wave music was great and somehow viewed as underground, though everyone knew about it and listened to some of it. Memories of the 1990s, politically and in terms of world politics, it was a lot less stressful than the 70s and 80s. That all came to an end on the 9th of November 2001, of course. Media, ads, movies, TV, etc. became more cynical, and people preferred drier wit. The era of aggressive fashion from the 1970s and 1980s ended, and clothing was less experimental and expressive. No more loud colors and patterns or wild cuts like bell bottoms or giant shoulder pads. Lots of black clothing. Popular music merged with rap and R&B, and became less boppy. Story 4. I grew up in a poor province of a third world country. The 90s in my village was not fun. My family lived below the poverty line, just like more than half of the country population. We were not starving, but having to skip a meal was not rare, and meat was a luxury. My village did not have running water, so it was my job to carry water from the well back home. We shared a toilet for the whole commune, which is just a hole on the ground. Fun fact, I did not live in a house with modern toilet until I was already a man. We had electricity for 2 or 3 hours per day, if we were lucky. So of course no one had appliances like a washing machine or fridge. Most houses only had a few light bulbs, a fan or two and a radio. One house had a 14 inches black and white TV. They were the star. We would gather at their house to watch the news every evening. We generally had electricity around 7 PM to 9 PM. Traveling was a huge pain. The best most of us can afford was a bicycle. If you own a bike then you are rich, and cars were a myth for us children. Some of my relatives moved away, and it was hard to visit each other. We also had like 1 or 2 phones for the whole village. Cell phone might as well be the replicator. Whenever someone called us, the phone owner would tell them to call back in 5, run to our houses, and tell us to come with them. But at least it was still better than the 80s or 70s. I did not experience those times personally, but we had a war that killed millions of our countrymen. Then embargo, hunger, and social unrest. I'm grateful that things improved so much throughout the last 3 decades. My children can now live a life that me or my parents didn't even dare to dream of back then. Story 5. Born in the 80s, but grew up in the 90s. A lot more smoking. Every high school had some spot, the dumpsters, the visitor bleachers, the one tree out back where kids smoked. The last few rows on airplanes were reserved for smokers and were covered in a thick haze you had to go through if you wanted to use the bathroom. Cars had ashtrays built into the armrests that I got yelled at for flipping open and closed when I got bored. Info gathering was more diverse. If you wanted a pizza, you had to get the phone book and call. To see a movie, check the newspaper for theater showings. For a search, go to the library. All that can be done on a phone now. Story 6. There was a certain sense of optimism. In the 90s at least. I was only a child, but even then I could feel a general consensus amongst people that things were okay, mellow, maybe. Not to mention, there was a prevailing excitement that we were building up to an entirely new millennium. So I think everyone had this hope that good things were waiting behind that door. The end of war, the end of poverty, sickness, what have you. The 20th century had been hell. 2 world wars, Vietnam, a Cold War. People were ready to see something better, and for a brief while, we did. Then 9/11 happened and it all went belly up. Story 7. I was 9 years old in '89. So the 90s encapsulated my entire teen years. It was great. It had an easy, stress-free feel to it. The music culture was still very alive, and we had some great music. We didn't have cell phones or social media, so I could leave the house and no one would know where I was unless I wanted them to. Thank God I didn't have a cell phone. I got in enough trouble with a disposable camera. Can only imagine how that world have gone with a cell phone and social media. I had a pager. I thought I was so cool. My pager message included the word WhatsApp, cause you know, I was cool. The only pressure I had to conform to beauty standards came from 17 magazine and Cosmopolitan, not Instagram. The 90s was a gem and most of us didn't realize it while we were in it. That being said, enjoy your decades. Who knows which one will be the next 90s, and you'll miss it too if you're not paying attention. Story 8. I was born in 84, so I don't remember much of the 80s, but remember all of the 90s. It felt like a simpler time. You actually had to wait for things. You couldn't just buy whatever from Amazon. I remember my parents had an actual checkbook with a register that they recorded their transactions in. As an adult, I don't know how they did it. By the time I had my own bank account, I could view everything online. In my neighborhood, we still had a little corner store where you could buy penny candy. Everything seemed really peaceful. I had a great childhood in the 90s. Story 9. The music was excellent. The food options were what your mom cooked, or not. If your mom wanted, or cared, to know where you were, she just looked down the street to see which yard all the bikes were in. You know you were allowed back in the house only when the street light came on. I said light because my mother had to buy a street light to put in our backyard. There were no lights on our street. If you traveled overnight, the kids slept in the back. The oldest kid got the back seat, the middle got the floorboard, and the youngest, me, got to sleep in the back dash. You collected the green bottle Coca-Cola bottles. The big ones were worth 10 cents and the small ones were worth 5. So 2 big and 1 small would get you a quarter, which was enough for another Coke and a candy bar. When we were thirsty, we drank out of the hose. Let it cool down first. If you hear a snippet of a song, say heard a bit on the AM radio, while way out of broadcast range, you had to remember the song and hope someone could recognize it when you described it. Took me 4 years to find one. If you wanted to make a mixtape, you clicked record on a handheld recorder in front of the speaker and prayed that the DJ didn't speak over the intro. We played all day long without parental supervision. We biked 4 miles. At 12, I walked down the road with a .22 and my friend with a 12 gauge, and the only thing any adult said to us was be careful. We walked or biked everywhere. You got a new bike every Christmas, and it was usually torn down and rebuilt by February. We had to know how to change our own chains, change our own bearings, and balance our own wheels. Just to name a few. And the bonus, there is no video evidence of the stupid things we did. Story 10. Gen X guy here, and from my experience it was a beautiful time to grow up. I grew up on coast in SoCal. Lots of freedom, and no internet to distract you. We were always outside playing football in street, or hitting baseballs at park, or skateboarding all over the place with no cell phones for parents to constantly track us. This forced us to be self-reliant. In summer we ride our bikes to beach and ride waves all day, listen to music on our radios, which everyone would hear, not just individually on AirPods isolated in your own world, etc. I miss those days, and as a father of middle schoolers I wish they could have experienced it. The cell phone and internet was a nuclear bomb that screwed up the way kids grow up. Just my opinion. Story 11. Born in 83 here, so early millennial. Can't remember too much of the 80s, it sort of folds into one blur of childhood, but I can remember things like my grandparents being young, my parents in their 20s, and playing outside a lot. The TV and music was great. We had Transformers and Shoe People and Raggy Dolls and stuff like that. I remember primary school and the summers seeming endless. I remember my dad won £3,000 on the football pools at some point as well. Loads of money back then. He bought a new car and paid off part of the mortgage. The 90s though seemed like an amazing time. I can remember going out and playing with my friends, literally saying to my mum see you later, picking up my bike and going off to find my friends and not coming home till later, having to knock on their doors to see if they were playing and talking to their parents. I remember building dens and going exploring, stuff like that. I can remember going swimming for a quid, it was 90p, to get in the pool, leaving 10p for the locker, and once Apu got that back, you use the 10p for a chomp chocolate bar from the vending machine. The video games were amazing. We started with the SNES and finished with the PS1 and N64. Meeting up at a friend's house to play GoldenEye is a defining memory. Kids didn't have phones and things just felt safer. Plans were made to meet up rather than texting. I can remember things not being so money oriented. We weren't well off, but survived on just my dad's wage and even got to have a holiday. Not abroad though, once a year. TV was good. There was no streaming or on demand, so you'd make sure you were home to watch the show Apu wanted, or you'd miss it. Kids TV was good. Stuff like Turtles, Power Rangers and Captain Planet. The tail end of Transformers 2. I can remember getting internet at home for the first time was completely different to today, with no social media, loads of different search engines. Can remember my ed teacher telling me Alta Vista would be the big one. Online gaming was, for me, expensive, but I still managed to be in a Quake clan. Politically here in the UK, things felt like they were changing for the better. I was getting into my teens at the end of the 90s and learning about politics. It was the era of New Labour and Cool Britannia, Britpop and all that sort of stuff. There was positivity everywhere that things were changing for the better. Not everything was about making as much money as possible, and social programs were put in place to increase education and for people to better themselves. It really did feel like we were on the cusp of something good, kind of like you are living the future as you got towards the year 2000. It all changed with 9/11 though. World has been a darker place since. Story 12. Picture this. You and your pals are out riding your bikes on a sunny Saturday in October. You can smell burning leaves, as people would take the leaves in the yard into a pile and burn them. You're telling Jason, Chris, Scotty and Dave about the awesome show you watched on Channel 8 last night. You can't remember the name, but it had aliens and laser guns in it. Oh well, it may come on again in a few years. You head into the forest behind your school. You see Jennifer, Heather, Jenny, Rhonda and Jen from your class at the edge of the forest, nervously smoking cigarettes. You wave at Jen, as you two made out last year at the year-end dance. But you haven't really talked since then. You don't know her phone number, and are too nervous to ask her. As you go into the forest, Scotty tells you he wants to show you something. You figure it's a dead cat or something. As you lead your bikes through the brush, you step over the piles of white dog shit everywhere. Jason pulls out some firecrackers and a book of matches and starts lighting them off and throwing them at you and the other guys. You don't think it's safe, but don't want to be called a pussy or queer, so you just ignore him. Everyone laughs at Jason's antics. What's the worst that could happen? Scotty leads you to an old stump. Under the stump is a brown paper grocery bag. He excitedly pulls it out and starts passing around what's inside. They're magazines. Oh, there's naked ladies on them. Wild. As you guys sort through the trove of forest porn, you end up with an over 40. The women in it look like your teacher, your Aunt Carol, the lady at the store where you buy your G.I. Joe comic books. But you're amazed at the wanton display of nudity. You can see their hooha's and boobs. The forest is silent as the group of young boys are initiated into the world of pornography. Nothing will ever be the same. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more daily videos.